Instead, Texas, 1945. The war in Europe had ended, but behind the barbed wire fences of a quiet camp near Fredericksburg, not everyone was free. The desert wind carried the scent of mesquite and dust across endless plains where rows of wooden barracks stood beneath the sun. Inside, German women, former nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, hung laundry on lines, their hands cracked from work, their eyes still tracing the horizon as if searching for home. Across the yard, American guards leaned against the fence, their rifles slung low, their voices soft with curiosity more than command. It was a strange piece, fragile and human, stitched together by chores, glances, and silence. Letters from Germany arrived with stories of ruins and hunger, while the Texas soil beneath their feet felt warm, alive, untouched by war. Some women began to smile again, some learned to speak English, and a few, quietly and impossibly, began to fall in love with the men once sent to guard them. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the world exhaled. But for tens of thousands of Axis prisoners scattered across America, the war didn't end with the signing of documents. Texas alone held dozens of camps, fenced towns within towns, where prisoners of war waited for repatriation that no one could yet organize. Most of them were men, soldiers from North Africa, U-boat crews, Luftwaffe mechanics. But in a few remote facilities, groups of female German auxiliaries and civilian workers were also interned, transferred under Geneva Convention categories that blurred the line between combatant and civilian. These women had worked in hospitals, military kitchens, communication units, and occupied territories. They had been caught in the collapsing chaos of retreat, swept into Allied custody, and shipped across the ocean to a land they had only seen on postcards. Texas was unlike anything they had ever known. The camps were built near farmland and cattle country, surrounded not by bombed cities but by wide horizons. The Red Cross inspected the barracks, ensuring compliance with international law, and compared to the ruins of post-war Europe, these places seemed almost humane. Prisoners received 3 meals a day, fair treatment, and even small wages for labor. They could write letters, attend church, and listen to music. To many, it felt unreal. How could captivity feel gentler than home? The American guards, mostly young men who had never left the continent before, found themselves assigned to watch over people who looked and spoke like them. Some had fought in Europe and carried memories of combat. Others had never seen the front lines at all. Yet in the quiet of Texas, hatred didn't thrive easily. There were no air raids, no propaganda, no orders to dehumanize. Only dust, sunlight, and long hours of routine. Fences divided the land, but not always the people. Among the prisoners, the women's presence altered the atmosphere. They introduced calm, organization, even warmth into spaces once dominated by soldiers. Many volunteered in camp hospitals or kitchens, showing care for the sick, sometimes even for the guards themselves. American officers noticed the difference. Discipline was firm, but respect grew naturally. Some women were invited to work outside under supervision, helping local farmers or sorting produce for military contracts. For the Texans, they were foreign yet fascinating, pale-skinned, soft-spoken, wearing patched uniforms and carrying themselves with a quiet dignity. The locals' first reaction was cautious. The war had painted Germans as ruthless enemies, yet these women were not soldiers. They were human, visibly weary, often frightened, occasionally defiant. When they began working in nearby fields, some farmers would bring them food or lemonade under the summer heat. The guards didn't always stop them. It wasn't sympathy at first, it was curiosity, perhaps pity. But something began to shift in perception. These weren't the monsters of wartime posters. They were young women far from home, trapped in the wrong uniform, and their captors could see it. Letters from Germany arrived sporadically, each envelope carrying a weight heavier than any barbed wire. News of bombed cities, missing fathers, starving families. Some women wept in secret, others in open despair. But in the vast stillness of Texas, the war felt distant, like a fever dream. They began to notice the rhythm of this land. Cattle drives in the distance, hymns from church bells on Sunday, cicadas buzzing through dusk. The sky stretched forever, unscarred by planes. By late 1945, the camp routine had become a life of its own. The women organized language classes, sewing groups, and even Christmas plays. American officers allowed limited social interactions, under strict rules. A few guards shared newspapers or music records. When the women were invited to local dances hosted by churches under Red Cross supervision, it became a small sensation. Enemy prisoners dancing with Texans under the same roof. The world was learning to breathe again, and even in captivity, life was quietly rebuilding itself. Inside the camp, one unspoken truth lingered. No one knew when they would go home, or what home meant anymore. Germany lay in ruins, divided by new borders and foreign armies. Letters stopped coming for some. Others heard their families were gone. And so, for a few women, the camp stopped feeling like a cage. It became a strange, gentle waiting place between two lives, one destroyed, one not yet begun. The American guards noticed this shift too. They began to talk, sometimes cautiously, sometimes openly. Friendship grew in the most unlikely corners, over coffee in the mess hall, during long work shifts, or in the quiet moments after evening roll call. Bonds were forming between people who had been trained to hate each other. And outside those fences, the land of Texas, open, free, endlessly forgiving, waited. The fences would still stand for a while, but hearts were already beginning to cross them. By early 1946, Texas had become home to one of the largest concentrations of Axis prisoners in America. Though most camps were expected to close within a year, the process of repatriation moved slowly. Trains carrying prisoners east were delayed by bureaucracy, shortages, and new political tensions in occupied Europe. For many German women, this delay felt like suspended time, a fragile, in-between life where the boundaries of enemy and host began to blur. Inside the wire, they were still prisoners. Outside it, they were treated with a respect few expected. The daily rhythm of camp life grew softer. The women woke before sunrise, washed in the dim light of lanterns, and gathered for morning roll call. The guards, often farm boys barely older than them, read names in the dusty air while the Texas sun climbed higher. Some women worked in laundry units, others helped in the fields or sorted supplies for the local army depot. The Americans admired their discipline, the Germans admired their casual kindness. Over time, both sides began to talk, not about war or politics, but about home, weather, and food. Outside the fences, the surrounding communities were changing too. Farmers struggled with labor shortages, their sons were still overseas or wounded, and crops demanded hands. Under new wartime agreements, selected prisoners were allowed to work under supervision, earning small wages redeemable only at the camp canteen. For the German women, this was more than labor, it was escape. Working in the open air, surrounded by horses, dust, and fields of cotton, they felt the first taste of freedom. Local newspapers began printing small stories about the girls from over there. They were polite, hardworking, even cheerful. The rumors spread quickly in small Texas towns. The Germans were not what WWII radio had described. They sang while they worked, shared recipes, and sent handmade gifts to children in nearby schools. Soon, invitations appeared from church communities wanting to host holiday gatherings for the POWs under Red Cross oversight. These events, meant as gestures of goodwill, quietly became moments of connection. Music bridged the gap faster than words. In community halls lit by yellow bulbs, American fiddles met German folk songs. Cowboys taught the women how to swing dance. The women responded with laughter and shy steps. They were still prisoners technically, but laughter could not be fenced in. Some of the guards, especially those stationed far from home, found comfort in conversation with the prisoners. Many of the women spoke good English, learned in school before the war. They shared books, exchanged idioms, even discussed the future, though it was unclear what future meant for either side. Letters from Germany painted a grim picture: burned cities, cold winters, millions displaced. The women knew that even if they returned, nothing would be the same. In contrast, the Texas landscape seemed timeless, unchanged by bombs or ideology. The smell of hay, the rhythm of ranch life, and the steady decency of its people felt like peace itself. Over time, some of the American officers began to trust the women enough to loosen restrictions. The camp gates were opened for supervised work in local businesses. German nurses assisted in small-town hospitals. Clerks helped inventory warehouses, and gradually Texans began to see these women not as prisoners, but as guests who had endured the same war from the other side. In Fredericksburg, a town with deep German roots, the connection ran even deeper. Many residents still spoke the language of their ancestors, and their empathy came naturally. Shopkeepers sent bread and fruit to the camps, church choirs visited to sing Christmas hymns, and families invited prisoners for Sunday services. For some of the women, it was the first time they had been treated not as captives, but as equals. It was during these small acts of kindness that something unexpected began to bloom. Beneath the slow Texas sunsets, friendships turned to affection. An American farmer might linger too long after delivering supplies. A German nurse might find herself smiling when a guard brought her extra sugar for coffee. The lines between duty and feeling blurred quietly, without anyone daring to name it. They didn't plan it. It simply happened. The distance between their worlds, enemy and liberator, war and peace, was shrinking with every sunrise. What began as tolerance had become familiarity. What began as civility was becoming love. For the first time in years, the German women felt seen, not as symbols of a lost cause, but as people again. And in the Texas wind, carrying the scent of mesquite and freedom, they began to wonder if the life they were supposed to return to was already gone. The war was over, but their story was just beginning. In every war story, there comes a moment when the labels of friend and enemy begin to fade. Texas became one of those places where such lines blurred, not through politics or treaties, but through simple human contact. The women who had arrived behind barbed wire, as nameless prisoners, were beginning to take shape as individuals. Each had a story, a family, a memory of a Germany that no longer existed. For the Americans who watched over them, it was impossible not to see that humanity shining through the dust and fatigue. The human angle of this unlikely chapter in history began with loneliness. For the women, the war had taken everything: homes, brothers, fathers, even faith in their nation's cause. In Texas, isolation hung heavy. The nights were long, the horizon endless, and news from Europe was grim. But within that emptiness grew resilience. The German women rebuilt their days around small acts of order: cooking, cleaning, writing, organizing music recitals. These routines became lifelines, keeping them tethered to something normal when the world had collapsed. The Americans, too, were lonely in their own way. Many guards were young men from rural backgrounds who had never traveled beyond their county lines. They had been drafted into a war that ended before most saw combat. Assigned to guard prisoners instead of fighting them, they carried the strange guilt of never having proven themselves on the battlefield. Watching these women endure captivity with grace stirred something unfamiliar: respect, curiosity, even admiration. Gradually, an understanding formed. Both sides were victims of a machine larger than themselves. The Americans were not conquerors, the Germans were not monsters. They were simply people surviving the aftermath of chaos. This mutual recognition opened the door to something powerful: empathy. The moral angle came next. War had taught both sides about propaganda and hatred. Yet here they were, sharing bread across a fence. Many guards found themselves conflicted. They had been trained to distrust the enemy, yet the women's kindness was disarming. One chaplain wrote in his diary that he had never witnessed such humility from people who had supposedly lost everything. He described a Christmas service where German women sang Silent Night in their language and American soldiers joined softly in English. In that moment, he said, the war finally ended. For the women, these acts of kindness carried deep moral weight. They had been raised under a regime that glorified power and obedience. In Texas, they encountered a society built on freedom, generosity, and tolerance, even toward its enemies. It was a quiet revelation that shook the foundations of everything they had been taught. The guards' fairness, the locals' hospitality, even the casual ease of American life contrasted sharply with the rigid discipline of wartime Germany. Many women later wrote in memoirs or letters that their captivity had taught them what real freedom felt like. Still, not all moments were gentle. Suspicion lingered among some officers, and discipline remained strict. Any sign of disobedience was met with swift punishment. But the majority of interactions stayed calm, professional, and increasingly humane. When local farmers requested more workers, command reluctantly approved, seeing it as an economic necessity. What they didn't foresee was that these work details would change lives forever. Working alongside Texans on open ranches gave the women something the camp could not: purpose. They learned to handle horses, mend fences, and manage crops. Cowboys, amused by their determination, taught them how to ride or swing a rope. Laughter returned. The women, used to the gray order of Europe, were suddenly surrounded by colorless freedom: the endless silver plains, the wide black skies at night, the wind that carried the scent of cedar and rain. Even though everything remained in shades of dust and sweat, to them it felt alive again. Through these shared labors, bonds deepened. Trust replaced distance. Texans found themselves impressed by the women's strength and dignity. The women were drawn to the Americans' warmth and openness. They didn't see each other as symbols of nations anymore, just as people trying to rebuild. But beneath every act of compassion lay a quiet tension. The war might have ended, but bureaucracy hadn't. Orders still demanded that all German prisoners, men and women alike, be sent home once transport became available. The women knew this, and so did the guards. It made every conversation, every shared moment, fleeting and precious. For some Americans, especially those who had lost brothers in Europe, this closeness was uncomfortable. Not everyone approved of the friendliness developing in the camps. Local newspapers occasionally received letters from citizens condemning the spoiling of prisoners. Yet others defended the humane treatment, reminding readers that America was showing the world how true victory looked, not through revenge, but through decency. Inside the camps, that decency became daily life. The fences still stood, but they no longer felt like barriers. They marked boundaries of law, not of spirit. Some guards brought books for the women to read. Others taught them slang or jokes. One officer organized English lessons that soon became storytelling sessions, where laughter echoed under the Texan sky. And through all this, something deeply human unfolded, an invisible bridge built not from words but from gestures. A cup of coffee shared through wire, a photograph of a family passed between hands, a quiet conversation at dusk about faith, loss, and what might come next. In these moments, war's bitterness melted into something timeless, the recognition that compassion, even between former enemies, can survive anything. The fences remained, but every day they seemed to matter less. What began as captivity was quietly turning into connection. And beyond those fences, Texas stretched open and free, waiting to see what would happen when love dared to cross the line. The romantic angle of this story was never planned. It didn't begin with grand gestures or reckless defiance, but with quiet familiarity that grew between work shifts and long Texas evenings. A guard would hand over tools, a German woman would thank him in broken English, and they'd both linger for a moment longer than necessary. The war had created boundaries in their minds, but Texas, the land of open skies and unspoken dreams, had a way of softening them. At first, these moments were nothing more than fleeting kindnesses. The guards brought extra bread or coffee, the women mended shirts and handed them back neatly folded. Yet kindness is contagious, and before long it became conversation. The Americans talked about rodeos, family ranches, and country music. The Germans spoke of forests, rivers, and homes that no longer existed. Between them grew an understanding. Both had lost something, and both were searching for a piece of normal life that the war had stolen. Outside the camp, the world was rebuilding. Towns held dances again. Church bells rang freely. Sometimes the Red Cross or local pastors organized small community gatherings to show goodwill. Under lantern light and the slow rhythm of folk songs, guards and prisoners moved as partners, not as captor and captive. The sight was surreal. Uniforms beside civilian dresses, laughter echoing through air once filled with suspicion. It wasn't rebellion, it was release. For the German women, affection came with guilt. They had been taught loyalty to homeland and uniform, even in defeat. But every letter from Europe spoke of ruin, hunger, and despair. Here in Texas, they found kin, finesse, safety, and the first sense of being alive again. Some began to realize that home wasn't a place anymore. It was wherever they were treated with dignity. The American men, many from humble towns, were struck by these women's grace and resilience. They were not conquerors seeking romance. They were men drawn to strength and sorrow they recognized in themselves. Many had lost friends in the Pacific or Europe. They had seen destruction from afar, and in these quiet interactions, they found healing. Soon, whispers spread through the camps and nearby towns. A few soldiers were writing letters on behalf of German women to local churches or farms, helping them apply for extended stays as laborers. One guard stationed near Hearne was disciplined after being discovered passing notes to a prisoner he later married. Officially, such unions were prohibited. Unofficially, the military turned a blind eye if it kept morale stable. The cultural angle added another layer. Texas itself had deep German roots. Settlers who had come generations earlier preserving their traditions, music, and food. When these new German women arrived, they brought echoes of that heritage. They spoke the same old dialects, cooked familiar dishes, and sang folk songs that locals remembered from their grandparents. For many Texans, this wasn't an invasion. It was a return of something ancestral. The women were seen not as strangers, but as reminders of where parts of Texas had come from. Integration began quietly. Some local families hired them to help on ranches or in kitchens. They shared meals, prayers, and laughter. For the first time since the war began, the women heard genuine warmth in a stranger's voice. Cowboys taught them to ride, farmers taught them the rhythm of planting and harvest. These women, once nurses and clerks, became part of the land's pulse, adapting quickly to its demands and freedom. Not everyone approved. Some officers reminded their men that fraternization violated orders. Yet the human heart has never been bound by regulations. What began as mutual respect often deepened into something neither side could name aloud. Love in such a place and time felt both impossible and inevitable. By the end of 1946, small but undeniable signs appeared. A guard stayed behind after his shift, helping a woman carry water buckets. A local rancher petitioned to hire 2 German women permanently, citing their honesty and hard work. Another woman, whose fiancé had died on the Eastern Front, was baptized in a Texas church by her own request. These moments didn't make headlines, but they changed lives. As repatriation orders loomed, the air in the camps grew tense. Many women faced impossible choices: return to a shattered homeland or remain illegally in a foreign one. Some chose love over legality. They married American men under quiet church ceremonies, often with local witnesses and sympathetic priests. A few fled before transport officers could record their names. For every one of these stories, there were dozens of others who never crossed that line, but all shared the same question: where did their loyalty belong now? For those who stayed, life unfolded with surprising peace. They became ranch wives, teachers, and mothers, weaving their lives into the Texas landscape so seamlessly that decades later, few remembered they had once been prisoners. Their children grew up bilingual, carrying 2 histories, one of war and one of healing. And through it all, the land remained the silent witness. The wind carried their laughter across the plains. The same fences that once kept them in now marked the boundaries of their homes. Texas, with its sun and silence, had turned captivity into belonging. Love had survived the war, quietly, stubbornly, without asking for permission. By the summer of 1946, word began to spread through the camps. The transports were coming. Europe, though scarred and broken, was calling its citizens back. For many of the German prisoners, this meant freedom. But for a small number of women in Texas, it meant heartbreak. They had found something far more powerful than freedom: belonging. The telegrams from Washington were clear. All Axis prisoners were to be repatriated within the year, regardless of circumstance. But inside the dusty fences of Texas, people were quietly refusing to let go. The announcements came during morning roll call. A colonel read the orders aloud as the women stood silently, faces still from shock. Some smiled with relief. They would see home again. Others froze, their eyes unfocused, already imagining what waited across the Atlantic: bombed-out streets, hunger, loss. A few stepped out of line, asking permission to stay and continue work for the farmers who had taken them in. But policy was absolute. The war might have ended, yet bureaucracy marched on with military precision. That afternoon, the camp was filled with quiet tension. The women wrote letters, some to family they hoped still existed, others to Americans they'd come to love. Guards, usually easygoing, avoided eye contact. They knew what was coming, and for many it felt wrong. They had watched these women laugh, cry, and live alongside them. Now they were being sent away like pieces of cargo. As trains were prepared in nearby towns, the first departures began. Wooden cars were loaded not with weapons or supplies, but with people carrying small suitcases filled with fragments of 2 lives. Each goodbye was heavy. A few guards stood stiffly, hats pulled low, unable to speak. Others risked breaking decorum, shaking hands or whispering hurried farewells. But not Evie. Everyone boarded. In quiet defiance, several women refused repatriation outright. Some feigned illness, others slipped away during supervised work shifts. Texas was vast, its plains open and unforgiving, but also full of places to disappear. Those who had formed close ties with local families often found shelter. Farmers or ranchers would quietly tell officials that their helpers had left, though everyone knew they hadn't gone far. The military, overwhelmed by logistics and the end of demobilization, often let such cases slide. There were too many people to track, too many transports to organize. A handful of missing prisoners didn't seem worth chasing, especially in small rural communities where everyone knew everyone else. Among those who stayed behind, love stories became lifelines. In Fredericksburg, a young nurse named Liesel found work at a local hospital after her American guard arranged false paperwork through a sympathetic priest. In another camp near Brady, a German typist named Anneliese secretly married a former army sergeant, their ceremony witnessed by two locals who swore silence. There were no records, no headlines, only whispered acknowledgement among neighbors. For the Americans who fell in love with them, these decisions carried risk. Fraternizing with enemy prisoners could still bring court-martial charges, but few cared. They had seen too much of war's destruction to let paperwork define love. One former guard later recalled, "We weren't thinking about rules anymore, we were thinking about the future, and somehow she was part of it." For those who did leave, the journey home was painful. Ships carried them from New Orleans back across the Atlantic to a Germany in ruins. Many arrived to find that their homes no longer stood, their towns swallowed by rubble. Some wrote letters back to Texas, thanking the families and guards who had shown kindness. Others begged for sponsorships to return. A few succeeded. Under new immigration programs in the late 1940s, some German women who had worked on farms were quietly sponsored by Texans who remembered their faces and their decency. Not all stories ended so gently. There were tragedies, women who vanished on the way home, names lost in bureaucratic confusion. Others faced suspicion or hostility upon their return to Germany for fraternizing with the enemy. Some were interrogated, others shunned. They carried the memory of Texas like a forbidden dream, too bright, too kind, too distant. Meanwhile, in Texas, the men who had loved them tried to move on, though many never did. Ranch hands kept old photographs hidden in drawers. Letters, whoa, urine and yellowed, sat folded beneath medals and keepsakes. For some, those brief months had felt like a lifetime. Yet even as official history forgot these moments, the land remembered. In the early mornings when fog rolled over the fields, one could still find traces of the past. Foundations of old barracks reclaimed by weeds, rusted nails in the dirt, the faint outline of a fence that once divided two worlds. But in those same fields, families now worked the soil together, American men and German women who had once stood on opposite sides of a war. Their children spoke with Texan accents but carried European eyes. They were living proof of what the war could not destroy, the human heart's stubborn refusal to obey lines drawn by governments. And though no headlines ever marked it, this quiet defiance, this refusal to be enemies, was one of the war's most beautiful rebellions. The trains rolled out of Texas that autumn, carrying hundreds of German prisoners back toward the ruins of their homeland. Steam hissed against the platforms, and American soldiers called out names from long lists, checking them off as if they were freight. Yet scattered across the state, in the quiet folds of its vast plains, a handful of women never boarded. They had slipped beneath the radar of bureaucracy, choosing the unknown over a future among ashes. Their decision was both illegal and deeply human. For them, captivity had turned into belonging, and Texas, dusty, wide, forgiving, had become home. One of those women, recorded years later in a local newspaper under a changed name, remembered the moment she chose to stay. "They said we could go home," she recalled, "but where was home? My town was gone, my parents were gone, all I had was here, the people who treated me kindly." Her story mirrored dozens of others whispered across rural Texas. Beneath the open sky, former prisoners began new lives as laborers, teachers, and quietly, wives. In Fredericksburg, the transformation was almost poetic. The town's German heritage gave the ex-POWs a kind of invisible shield. Locals spoke their language, understood their customs, and often helped smooth over the paperwork that made them legal residents. Weddings took place in small chapels under flickering candles, attended by neighbors who had long since stopped caring about the rules. For these couples, the vows they made were not only of love, but of defiance against a world that had forced them apart. But for others, the road to acceptance was harder. Some Americans, still haunted by the war's pain, could not understand why their sons were marrying the enemy. Families argued, communities I did. A few couples left Texas altogether, heading west to California or north to Oklahoma to start fresh where no one knew their past. Those who stayed endured whispers but found comfort in the land's quiet rhythm. In time, the gossip faded. Work spoke louder than memory, and decency became the measure of belonging. For the women, adapting meant shedding an identity built around loss. They traded uniforms for cotton dresses, barracks for small ranch houses, and fear for a kind of grounded peace. Many learned to cook Southern dishes, care for cattle, and raise children who would never know the taste of war. The sounds of their new lives, roosters at dawn, creaking porch swings, laughter drifting through hot evenings, replaced the echoes of air raid sirens that had once haunted them. Some of the marriages drew quiet attention from journalists. In 1947, a reporter from the Dallas Morning News wrote of former enemy women who became citizens through love. The tone was cautious but curious, highlighting how these women worked hard, attended church, and adopted the American way of life with grace. A few stories reached national audiences, briefly turning them into symbols of reconciliation. But for most, anonymity was the truest freedom. They didn't seek recognition. They sought peace. Meanwhile, in Germany, the returnees who had obeyed orders faced a different fate. Rebuilding a nation shattered by war left little room for sentiment. Many of the women who had returned from Texas found themselves haunted by comparison. Letters that crossed the Atlantic in secret spoke of regret. One woman wrote, "America was strange, but it was kind. Here, everything is familiar, but nothing feels alive." The United States government, busy with post-war reconstruction and the Marshall Plan, never officially acknowledged the handful who stayed behind. They simply disappeared into the folds of American life, their past quietly erased. In Texas, their new lives unfolded like the land itself, slow, steady, deeply rooted. Children were born who never knew the fences their mothers once stood behind. They grew up riding horses, speaking 2 languages, and carrying 2 histories. The local schools listed their mothers simply as immigrants, never as prisoners. When asked where they were from, most answered, "Here." By the early 1950s, the camps had vanished. The barracks were dismantled, the fences melted down, the watchtowers torn apart for lumber. But in some small towns, remnants remained. Stone chimneys swallowed by weeds, foundations scattered in the soil. Farmers plowed over the old footprints of war, planting cotton where barbed wire once stood. Life had reclaimed the lay. And for those who had stayed, the transformation was complete. They became pillars of their communities, known for hard work and quiet grace. Their accents softened over time, but not their memories. Some kept small boxes hidden in their homes, photographs from the camp, letters written in fading ink, fragments of a past they never wanted to forget entirely. They had crossed an invisible border, not between nations, but between fear and hope. Years later, when one of these women was asked if she ever regretted staying, she smiled softly. "I was supposed to go back to Germany," she said, "but my heart stayed here. Texas didn't ask where I came from. It just let me stay." Her words captured what so many had lived, a quiet triumph of humanity over history. The war had been fought with weapons, but peace was built with compassion, with the courage to see the enemy as human. By the end of the decade, many of these former prisoners had become naturalized citizens. Their names appeared on voter rolls, church registries, and birth certificates. Their stories, once whispered in fear, became part of the region's folklore, an unwritten chapter in the long story of how America healed from its greatest war. And though few monuments mark their existence, the legacy they left behind was powerful in its simplicity. That love, decency, and forgiveness can flourish even in the most unlikely places, behind fences, across languages, and beneath the endless Texas sky. When the last trains left Texas in 1947, they carried away the final visible signs of captivity. The camps that had once echoed with German songs and American commands grew silent. Barbed wire rusted in the sun, and the empty barracks became storage sheds or were quietly dismantled by locals. For most Texans, the war faded into memory, but for those who had lived within those fences, especially the women who stayed, the end of the camps was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new kind of life, one built from fragments of 2 worlds that had collided by accident and refused to let go. The American men who had married the German women found themselves in uncharted territory. Their unions were both celebrated and scrutinized. Some families welcomed the women warmly, touched by their humility and strength. Others turned cold, unable to reconcile the idea that their sons had chosen brides from the other side of the war. Yet over time, attitudes softened. The women's quiet endurance, their work ethic, and their gentleness gradually dissolved suspicion. They cooked, gardened, raised children, and helped their husbands on the ranches. They didn't demand attention or sympathy. They simply lived, proving through action that love was stronger than memory. Many of them became unofficial ambassadors of reconciliation. Their presence bridged the unspoken distance between the 2 nations. Local pastors often remarked that these women seemed to carry peace wherever they went. In church gatherings, they sang hymns in English, but sometimes whispered the German verses under their breath, their voices soft but full of emotion. Their new communities began to cherish these differences rather than fear them. Still, practical challenges persisted. Citizenship was not immediate. The legal system had no precedent for enemy prisoners marrying American soldiers or civilians. Lawyers and judges in small Texas towns were left to interpret rules not yet written. Many of the women lived for years as stateless persons, unable to travel or vote. Yet none of them considered leaving. They built lives on trust and resilience, knowing that legality would one day catch up with love. A few of them became local legends. In one town near Temple, a woman named Marta, once a typist in a German field office, became the postmistress after marrying a ranch hand. Locals joked that she sorted mail faster than anyone else in the county. In another small community near Kerrville, a woman named Elise opened a bakery whose recipes came from her mother's German kitchen. People came from miles away for her rye bread and strudels, unaware that she had once worn a uniform marked with an eagle. These stories multiplied quietly, forming a network of invisible threads binding Texas to its unlikely chapter of wartime history. Home. Some laughed softly, remembering the guards who had tried to teach them baseball or the first time they saw snow melt over red dirt. Others grew quiet, thinking of those who had returned to Germany and never written back. For some, reunion letters did arrive, fragile paper from across the ocean, written in uncertain ink. Families who had survived reached out, astonished to learn their daughters or sisters were still alive, now living under American skies. Some reunions happened decades later when air travel finally made visits possible. Mothers who had believed their daughters dead embraced them at airports in Frankfurt or Hamburg, weeping not just for the lost years, but for the strange miracle that captivity had led to safety. The men who had married them aged with pride. They saw in their wives the embodiment of forgiveness, strength, and grace. Many of these men were quiet souls who worked the land until their last days, their love stories shared only in fragments with grandchildren who would later discover the truth in yellowed photographs. Two young people standing together, one in a faded American uniform, the other in a plain work dress, smiling shyly at the camera. By then, the government had long since forgotten about the missing names on the old repatriation lists. Bureaucracy had surrendered to time. The women who remained became naturalized citizens, their oaths taken in modest courthouse ceremonies with trembling voices and tears of relief. Some brought their children to witness the moment. "Now," one mother whispered to her son as she held her certificate, "we are both from here." Decades passed. The world moved on to new wars, new divisions. Yet their story endured quietly in the soil of Texas, retold by those who had lived nearby or by descendants who pieced together fragments of memory. Historians later uncovered camp logs, photographs, and Red Cross reports, official documents that hinted at the human warmth behind the rules. Scholars called it the paradox of kindness, the way America had treated its prisoners not with cruelty but with unexpected dignity. But for the women who had lived it, the experience was never an academic topic. It was life itself, painful, tender, real. Some spoke of guilt that never fully faded. They had survived when others hadn't, found love in a place meant for confinement. Yet when asked if they would change their decision, they always said no. "I was a stranger," one woman recalled, "and Texas made me family." As the years turned into decades, their children and grandchildren grew up unaware that their roots stretched across battle lines. Only later, through journals or photographs, did they come to understand the extraordinary choices that had made their existence possible. What had begun as a story of war had become a legacy of peace. As the 1950s unfolded, time did what laws and governments could not. It made peace permanent. Children born of these marriages grew up as Americans, speaking English at school and hearing German lullabies at night. They carried no shame, only curiosity. Teachers sometimes asked about their mother's accents. The answers came proudly. "She's from Germany, but she's a Texan now." Meanwhile, back in Europe, the story of the women who had stayed behind became a kind of rumor, a whispered tale among displaced families. To some, they were traitors who had abandoned their homeland. To others, they were brave women who had chosen life over misery. A few German newspapers in the early 1950s printed small human interest pieces about brides of Texas, framing them as symbols of forgiveness between nations. None of the women ever sought fame for it. Their reward was the simple peace of an ordinary day. And so the years passed. The war that had brought them to Texas became something their children read about in books. The fences were gone, the watchtowers forgotten, but the spirit of what had happened there remained alive in memory. In the way a husband touched his wife's hand while passing the same cotton fields where she once worked as a prisoner, or in the laughter of children running barefoot across soil once marked by guards' boots. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply found a gentler shape. By the 1960s, the story of the German women who had stayed in Texas was no longer a secret but a quiet piece of local history. The war had become something people spoke of in memories and films, and most who had lived it preferred silence over retelling. The women, now wives and mothers, carried their past with humility. They never boasted of their choices or romanticized the hardship. They simply existed, proof that compassion could outlast conflict. In Fredericksburg, Mason, and Hearn, their presence blended so deeply into the community that few newcomers even knew their origins. They became part of the rhythm of small-town life, church picnics, county fairs, and dusty summer afternoons. Their accents softened with time, though sometimes a stray German word slipped into conversation, like a thread of another world woven into the Texas drawl. Neighbors accepted it without thought. The old divisions had faded into something gentler, familiarity. Many of the women stayed in touch with each other, bound by shared history. They met occasionally, over coffee or in church groups, reminiscing about those early years behind the wire. How strange it had felt to be prisoners in a land that would one day become. When the last of these women passed away in the late 20th century, local newspapers sometimes printed small obituaries noting their unusual journeys. Former World War II prisoner, beloved mother, devoted wife, the lines read, simple, unassuming, yet monumental in meaning. Their lives had been quiet revolutions, proving that even the darkest chapters of history could end in grace. And so the story came full circle. The fences that once divided them from the world had long since vanished, replaced by open fields and quiet homesteads. Children played where guards once stood, and laughter rose where commands had echoed. The war had ended on paper in 1945, but for these women, peace had been found here, in the heart of Texas, where captivity became home. History often remembers wars for their destruction, battles, victories, and loss measured in numbers. Yet hidden between those pages are smaller stories, the ones that never made it into textbooks but shaped the meaning of peace itself. The tale of the German women who refused repatriation from Texas is one such story, a quiet defiance against hatred, and an affirmation that humanity can survive even after the world has torn itself apart. They arrived as prisoners, wearing the insignia of a defeated nation, expecting punishment. Instead, they found decency, music, and a strange foreign kindness that began to heal wounds no treaty could touch. The barbed wire that surrounded them became less a cage and more a boundary where two worlds met and learned to coexist. Love was never the plan, yet it bloomed anyway, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. What happened in those Texas camps was more than romance. It was reconciliation lived out in daily gestures. Bread shared, language exchanged, trust rebuilt. It was proof that victory did not have to mean humiliation, and that forgiveness could exist not in grand speeches but in the silence between two people who once stood on opposite sides of a war. Today, almost nothing remains of those camps. Only wind over open fields, the creak of old trees, and the distant echo of laughter that once defied the past. But the legacy endures in the generations that followed, families born from conflict, bound by love, and shaped by the belief that compassion is stronger than any flag. Behind the fences of Texas, humanity remembered itself, and in that forgotten corner of history, the war's end became something more profound than surrender. It became understanding.